Jack Morrison stood at the edge of the landing platform, looking out at the most incredible sight he had ever seen. The city of Nexus Prime stretched before him like something from a dream. Towers of blue crystal reached toward the purple sky, their surfaces glowing with soft light. Buildings floated in the air without any support, spinning slowly as they moved between the ground and the clouds. Strange vehicles flew through the air in perfect lines, making no sound at all. Jack adjusted his old leather tool belt and picked up his simple metal toolbox. He felt very small and out of place. Around him, beings from dozens of different worlds were gathering for the Galactic Engineering Council's biggest event of the year. Some looked like giant insects with multiple arms carrying glowing devices. Others were tall and thin with skin that changed colors as they moved. A few looked almost human but had extra eyes or strange markings on their faces. All of them carried equipment that Jack could not understand. Floating screens showed complex diagrams that moved and changed by themselves. Tools that looked like they were made of pure light hummed with energy. Some aliens had devices that seemed to bend space around them, making the air shimmer and wave. Jack looked down at his own things. His toolbox held a hammer, screwdrivers, measuring tape, a level, and some basic testing equipment. In his backpack he had samples of clay, dried grass, plant fibers, and small containers of different soils from Earth. Compared to everything around him, his tools looked like toys from a children's playground. A tall alien with 4 arms and skin like polished metal approached him. When it spoke, a small device on its chest translated its words into English. "You are the representative from the planet Earth, correct?" "Yes, sir," Jack replied, trying to sound confident. Jack Morrison, civil engineer from Oklahoma. The alien made a sound that the translator turned into laughter. "Civil engineer, how quaint. I am Zexnath, primary architect of the Zephyrian Empire. We build cities that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. What exactly do you build on your world?" Jack thought about his last project, a small community center in his hometown. "Well, I just finished a building that can hold about 200 people during tornado season. Used reinforced concrete and steel with a foundation that goes down 12 feet. More aliens had gathered around to listen. They all seemed to find something amusing about Jack's words. A creature that looked like a walking tree with glowing fruit for eyes spoke up. "Concrete? Steel? These are such primitive materials. We abandoned physical matter for construction purposes millennia ago. Our buildings are grown from living crystals," said another alien with tentacles instead of arms. "They repair themselves and can survive the heat of a star. My people construct with pure energy," added a being made of what looked like moving water. "Our cities exist in a state of controlled plasma, shaped by thought alone." Jack nodded politely, not really understanding most of what they were saying. He had studied the other civilizations before coming here, but hearing about their abilities in person was overwhelming. "That all sounds very impressive," he said honestly. Zexnath gestured toward a massive structure in the distance. It was a tower that seemed to be made of flowing light, constantly changing shape and color. "That is my latest creation. A residential complex that houses 10 million beings across multiple reality phases." The construction process required the energy output of 3 suns and materials that exist only in the space between atoms. The other aliens made sounds of approval. Jack tried to imagine what it would be like to live in a building made of light, but he could not wrap his mind around it. "What about you, human?" asked the tree-like being. "What marvels of engineering has your species created?" Jack thought carefully about his answer. "Well, we've built some pretty tall buildings. The tallest one is over half a mile high. We've got bridges that span miles across water and tunnels that go under mountains. We've built structures that can house millions of people and cities that stretch for hundreds of miles." The aliens exchanged glances. "Half a mile high," one of them said. "Our smallest residential units extend across light years." "Tunnels under mountains?" laughed another. "We simply phase shift our transportation through solid matter." Jack felt his face getting red, but he kept his voice steady. I know our technology isn't as advanced as yours, but our buildings work well for us. They keep people safe and comfortable. Safe from what? Asked Zexnath. Whether natural disasters? We learned to control such things before your species discovered fire. Actually, Jack said, pulling out a small notebook, I specialize in earthquake-resistant construction. Where I come from, we get a lot of seismic activity. I've developed some techniques that help buildings survive even major earthquakes. The laughter that followed was louder than before, the water being rippled with what looked like amusement. Earthquake-resistant? You mean you still experience uncontrolled geological events? We solved geological instability on our worlds billions of years ago, said the tree alien. We simply stabilize the planetary core with quantum harmonics. Or relocate problematic tectonic plates to alternate dimensions, added another Jack. Felt smaller and smaller with each comment. These beings had technologies that seemed like magic to him. They had moved beyond the physical limitations that humans still struggled with every day. Perhaps, said Zexnath, his tone becoming more condescending, you would like to observe our demonstrations? You might learn something about real engineering. The other aliens murmured agreement. Jack could tell they were being polite, but they clearly saw him as a primitive curiosity rather than a fellow engineer. I'd like that very much, Jack said. But I was hoping I might be able to show you some of our techniques as well. I brought some materials from Earth. This brought another wave of laughter. Materials? Said the tentacled alien. Physical materials? How delightfully archaic. What did you bring? Asked Zexnath, clearly amused. Stone tools? Wooden clubs? Jack opened his toolbox and pulled out a sample container. Clay, mostly. Some plant fibers, organic compounds, basic minerals. I know it doesn't look like much, but clay. The tree being's fruit eyes pulsed with bright light. You still use clay? We have museums dedicated to the primitive era, when our ancestors worked with such crude substances. It's quite charming, really, said the water being. Like watching a child play with mud. Jack felt a flash of anger, but he controlled it. I know it seems simple, but there's a lot of science behind how these materials work together. The way clay particles bond, how organic fibers distribute stress, the interaction between different— Yes, Zexnath interrupted, waving one of his four hands dismissively. I'm sure it's all very fascinating from a historical perspective. Tell you what, human. We'll set aside a small area where you can play with your mud and sticks. Think of it as a living exhibit of primitive engineering. The other aliens found this hilarious. Jack felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he nodded. I'd appreciate that, thank you. As the group began to move toward the main exhibition area, Jack heard them continuing to make jokes about his primitive tools and methods. He followed behind, carrying his simple toolbox and trying to ignore the comments about mud huts and Stone Age technology. But deep inside, Jack felt a spark of determination. These aliens might have incredible technology, but they had never faced the challenges that humans dealt with every day. They had never had to build something strong and reliable using only the materials the Earth provided. They had never had to make do with less than perfect conditions. Jack Morrison might be just a simple engineer from Oklahoma, but he had learned his trade in a world where failure meant people got hurt. He had spent his career making things work when the odds were against him. And maybe, just maybe, that experience would count for something here among the stars. Jack Morrison knelt in the small patch of dirt that the aliens had given him, running the soil through his fingers. The ground felt different from Earth soil, but not completely alien. It had clay content, good drainage, and seemed stable enough for basic construction. He pulled out a small pH testing kit and took several samples, carefully marking each one in his notebook. Around him, the Galactic Engineering Summit was in full swing. The aliens were busy showing off their incredible technologies to each other. He could hear excited chatter in dozens of languages, all being translated by the small devices they wore. Holographic displays showed complex blueprints that moved and changed as he watched. Strange machines floated through the air, scanning and measuring things he could not understand. Jack tried to focus on his work, but it was hard to ignore the magnificent structures being demonstrated nearby. The Zephyrians had built a small version of their quantum crystalline tower, only about 50 feet tall, but still impressive. The crystal material seemed to shift and flow like water, but when Jack tapped it gently with his finger, it felt harder than steel. The tower grew taller as he watched, adding new levels by rearranging its molecular structure. A group of aliens that looked like giant butterflies, with metal wings, had created a building that existed in multiple dimensions at once. From where Jack stood, it looked like a simple cube, but as he moved around it, he could see it was somehow also a sphere, a pyramid, and several other shapes all at the same time. His eyes began to hurt just looking at it. The most impressive display came from a species that resembled walking crystals. They had built a structure that was completely invisible except for its shadow. Jack could see the shadow on the ground, shaped like a complex geometric pattern, but when he looked up, there was nothing there. Other aliens walked through the space where the building should be, and Jack could hear their footsteps echoing. As if they were inside a large room, Jack shook his head and went back to his soil samples. These aliens had clearly mastered technologies that humans could barely imagine. But soil was soil, and construction principles were construction principles. He began mixing different ratios of clay, sand, and organic matter, testing how each combination held together. As he worked, he noticed that fewer aliens were stopping by to mock his primitive methods. They seemed to be getting distracted by something else. Conversations were becoming more urgent, and he heard the same word being repeated in several different languages, even though the translators were having trouble with it. Finally, a small alien that looked like a walking mushroom approached him. Its translator device was crackling with static, but he could make out its words. "Human, you should be aware that there is a situation developing." Jack looked up from his work, clay still stuck to his hands. "What kind of situation?" "The planetary geology team has discovered something concerning about Nexus Prime. The planet's tectonic structure is much more unstable than we initially thought." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Unstable how? Seismic activity, major seismic activity. The planet experiences frequent earthquakes, and the latest deep core scans indicate that a significant seismic event is likely to occur within the next few days. How significant? Jack asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. The geological team estimates magnitude 8.5 or higher on your Earth scale. Possibly as high as 9.2, Jack dropped his clay sample. A 9.2 earthquake was a civilization-ending event. He had studied the effects of earthquakes of that magnitude, and they were capable of leveling entire cities, even cities built with modern Earth technology. "What's the evacuation plan?" he asked. The mushroom alien's cap drooped slightly. "There is no evacuation plan. The summit includes representatives from over 40 different worlds. The logistics of emergency evacuation would take weeks to coordinate. The seismic event will likely occur within 72 hours. Jack looked around at all the impressive alien structures. "What about earthquake protection? Surely, with all this advanced technology, you can make the buildings earthquake-proof?" "The various species are implementing their emergency protocols now. You can see the activity increasing." Jack did see it. The previously calm and orderly demonstration area was now bustling with urgent activity. The Zephyrians were working frantically on their quantum crystalline tower, adding new layers of material and adjusting the molecular structure. Teams of four-armed aliens were installing glowing devices around the base of the tower, creating some kind of energy field. The butterfly-like aliens were expanding their multi-dimensional building, adding new geometric shapes and mathematical formulas that hurt to look at directly. Teams of smaller aliens were setting up complex equipment around the structure, projecting beams of colored light that intersected. In precise patterns, the crystal beings were doing something to their invisible building that Jack could not see, but he could hear it. Strange humming sounds filled the air, rising and falling in complex harmonies. Other crystal beings were placing devices that looked like tuning forks around the shadow on the ground, each one vibrating at a different frequency. Every species was working with incredible urgency, deploying technologies that represented thousands of years of advanced development. Energy shields flickered to life around various structures. Gravity manipulation devices created zones where debris would float harmlessly away. Some aliens were installing temporal stabilizers that would slow down time around their buildings, giving the structures more time to react to seismic stress. Jack watched in amazement as the aliens worked. They had solutions for problems that humans had never even imagined. Force fields that could repel physical matter. Quantum anchors that could lock a building's position in spacetime. Matter displacement arrays that could teleport dangerous debris away from populated areas. But as impressive as it all was, Jack could not shake a feeling of unease. All of these solutions were incredibly complex, requiring enormous amounts of energy and precise coordination. What would happen if the power failed? What if the quantum fields destabilized? What if the temporal effects interfered with each other? He had seen this before in a different way. During his career, he had worked on projects where engineers had tried to solve earthquake problems with complex technological solutions. Active dampening systems, computer-controlled support structures, advanced materials that could change their properties in response to stress. Most of these solutions worked well in theory and in laboratory conditions. But when a real earthquake hit, when power grids failed and communication systems went down, when dust and debris interfered with sensors, and when the ground itself became unreliable, the complex systems often failed in ways that simple structures did not. Jack looked down at his clay samples and his basic tools. He thought about the buildings he had designed back on Earth, structures that had survived major earthquakes, not because they were high-tech, but because they were built to work with natural forces rather than against them. Buildings that could bend without breaking, that could absorb energy rather than fighting it, that could continue to function even when everything else failed. He picked up a handful of clay and squeezed it, feeling how it held together under pressure but could also flex and bend. He pulled out some of the plant fibers he had brought from Earth, testing their strength and flexibility. These materials were not impressive to look at, but they had properties that even the most advanced alien technologies might not possess. Around him, the aliens continued their frantic preparations. Machines hummed with power, energy fields crackled with electricity, and complex calculations scrolled across holographic displays. The air filled with the sounds of advanced technology being pushed to its limits. Jack Morrison, the simple engineer from Oklahoma, rolled up his sleeves and got back to work. He had less than 3 days to build something that could survive one of the most powerful earthquakes in the galaxy. But for the first time since arriving on Nexus Prime, he felt like he might actually have a chance. The aliens had their advanced technology, but Jack had something they seemed to have forgotten about: the knowledge of how to build things that worked when everything else failed. Jack Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the small mound of clay mixture he had been working with for the past 6 hours. The consistency was finally right. He had tested dozens of different combinations, adding local plant fibers, adjusting the moisture content, and experimenting with different soil ratios until he found the perfect blend. Around him, the alien engineers continued their frantic work. The noise level had increased dramatically as more and more high-tech equipment was brought online. Energy generators hummed with power, force field projectors cast strange shadows, and quantum stabilizers filled the air with a low vibration that made Jack's teeth ache. The Zephyrians had tripled the size of their quantum crystalline tower and surrounded it with a complex array of energy shields. Teams of 4-armed aliens worked around the clock, adjusting field harmonics and calibrating quantum resonance frequencies. Their equipment filled an area the size of a football field, all focused on protecting one relatively small structure. Jack picked up his measuring tape and began marking out the foundation for his shelter. His design was simple: a small dome-shaped structure, about 10 feet across and 8 feet high at the center. Nothing fancy, nothing that would impress the aliens, but something that would work. As he worked, he noticed a young woman approaching his work area. She was human, which surprised him. He had not known there were other humans at the summit. "Excuse me," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Lisa Parker. I'm a journalist covering the summit for the Galactic News Network." Jack shook her hand, leaving some clay on her palm. "Sorry about that. Jack Morrison, civil engineer. I didn't know there were other humans here." "I arrived yesterday to cover the demonstrations," Lisa said, looking around at the chaos. "But now it looks like I'm going to be covering a disaster. Instead, can I ask what you're doing here while everyone else is panicking?" Jack gestured to his small work area. "Building a shelter. Same as everyone else, just using different methods." Lisa looked at his pile of clay and plant fibers, then at the massive alien construction projects surrounding them. "Different is one way to put it. Do you really think that's going to work against a magnitude 9 earthquake?" "I think it's got a better chance than most of what I'm seeing here," Jack replied, returning to his measurements. "How can you be so calm?" Lisa asked. "Those aliens have technologies that can manipulate space and time, and you're working with mud." Jack stopped measuring and looked at her seriously. "Have you ever been in a major earthquake?" "No, never." "I have. Several of them. The thing about earthquakes is that they don't care how advanced your technology is. They don't care how much energy you're pumping into your force fields or how many quantum fields you're projecting. An earthquake is just the Earth moving, and it's going to move whether you want it to or not." Jack pointed to the Zephyrian Tower. "Look at that structure. It's beautiful, and I'm sure it's incredibly strong, but it's also rigid. When the earthquake hits, that tower is going to try to stay exactly where it is while the ground underneath it moves. Something's got to give, and it's probably not going to be the ground." Lisa pulled out a small recording device. "Can I quote you on that?" "Sure," Jack said, beginning to dig his foundation. "But let me explain what I'm doing first, so you understand the science behind it." Jack began excavating a shallow circular depression in the ground. The work was slow and methodical, but he explained each step to Lisa as he went. "The first thing you need to understand about earthquake-resistant construction is that you can't fight the earthquake. The Earth is going to move, and your building needs to move with it. That's why I'm making this foundation shallow and wide. It's going to sit on the ground, not dig deep into it." Lisa watched as Jack shaped the foundation. "But don't deep foundations make buildings more stable?" "In normal conditions, yes. But in an earthquake, deep foundations can actually make things worse. If the foundation is locked deep in the ground and different parts of the ground move in different directions, the foundation can get torn apart. A shallow foundation can move as one unit with the surface layer of soil." Jack began laying the first courses of his clay mixture. The material was a gray-brown color, not particularly attractive, but it held together well and had a slight flexibility to it. "The next principle is flexibility," Jack continued. "Most of these alien structures are trying to be immovable. They're using energy fields and quantum locks to hold their buildings in exactly the same position. But flexibility is what keeps things from breaking." He demonstrated by bending a piece of the plant fiber he was using. "This fiber can bend almost in half without breaking. But if I try to bend this piece of metal," he picked up a small metal rod from his toolbox and bent it until it snapped. "It breaks because it's too rigid." Lisa was taking notes rapidly. "So you're saying that being flexible is better than being strong?" "I'm saying that being flexible is a different kind of strength. Watch this." Jack took a small sample of his clay mixture and rolled it into a ball. Then he threw it hard against a nearby rock. Instead of shattering, the clay ball flattened against the rock and then bounced back, slightly dented but still in one piece. The clay absorbed the energy of the impact by changing shape. If I had thrown a glass ball, it would have shattered. If I had thrown a steel ball, it would have either cracked the rock or bounced back so hard it could have hurt someone. But the clay just absorbed the energy and kept going." Jack continued building his structure, explaining each technique as he used it. He showed Lisa how he was weaving the plant fibers into the clay in specific patterns, creating a mesh that would distribute stress throughout the entire structure. "These fibers work like the steel reinforcement in concrete, but they're better in some ways. Steel is strong, but it's also rigid. If you stress it too much, it breaks suddenly and completely. But organic fibers like these are more forgiving. They stretch and bend, and even if some of them break, the rest of the mesh keeps working. As Jack worked, some of the aliens began to notice what he was doing. Small groups would stop by his work area, watch for a few minutes, and then move on. Jack could hear them making comments to each other, though he could not understand most of what they were saying. Cex-Nath, the lead Zephyrian engineer, approached with several other aliens. "Human, I am curious about your methodology. Are you attempting to create some sort of primitive force field using organic materials?" Jack looked up from his work, clay covering his hands and forearms. "Not exactly. I'm just building a shelter that can survive an earthquake." "Using mud," said one of the other aliens, a tall blue creature with tentacles for arms. "Using clay, plant fibers, and engineering principles that have been tested for thousands of years," Jack corrected gently. Zexnath examined the partially completed structure. "But how can such primitive materials withstand the forces we are preparing for? Our quantum crystalline matrix can withstand the gravitational field of a neutron star." "That's impressive," Jack said honestly. "But can it withstand the Earth moving sideways at 30 feet per second?" "The quantum locks will prevent any movement of the structure," Zexnath replied confidently. Jack paused in his work. "What happens if the quantum locks fail?" "They will not fail. The system has 17 layers of redundancy. What happens if they all fail at once?" Zexnath's forearms gestured dismissively. "The probability of total system failure is less than 1 in 10 billion, Jack nodded politely. "I'm sure you're right. But I've learned that when you're dealing with natural disasters, it's better to plan for what can go wrong rather than assume everything will go right." Lisa was writing frantically in her notebook. "Can you explain that principle?" "It's called graceful failure," Jack said, smoothing another layer of clay into place. "When you're building something that people's lives depend on, you don't just design it to work perfectly under perfect conditions. You design it to keep working even when things go wrong." He pointed to the alien structures around them. "All of these systems are designed to work perfectly, and they probably will. But they're all depending on power supplies, computer systems, and complex interactions between different technologies. If any part of the system fails, the whole thing might collapse." Jack gestured to his simple shelter. "This doesn't depend on power or computers or complex interactions. It's just clay, fibers, and physics. If part of it gets damaged, the rest of it keeps working." As the day wore on, more aliens stopped by to watch Jack work. Some seemed genuinely curious about his methods, while others were clearly just amused by the primitive human playing with mud. But Jack noticed that their comments were becoming less mocking and more thoughtful. The structure was taking shape now. The dome was about half complete, its smooth, curved surface rising from the shallow foundation. The clay had dried to a light brown color, and the plant fibers were visible as thin green lines running through the material. By evening, Jack had completed most of the main structure. It was not beautiful by alien standards, but it was solid and well-proportioned. Lisa had stayed to watch the entire process, asking questions and documenting everything. "How do you know it will work?" she asked as Jack began cleaning his tools. Jack looked at his simple shelter, then at the incredible alien technology surrounding it. Jack Morrison was putting the finishing touches on his shelter when the first tremor hit. It was small, just a gentle shaking that lasted about 10 seconds, but it was enough to make everyone at the summit stop what they were doing and look around. Nervously, "Was that it?" Lisa Parker asked, her voice tight with worry. Jack shook his head, testing the last section of clay with his fingers. "No, that was just a foreshock. The main event is still coming." Around them, the alien engineers immediately began checking their equipment. Status lights flickered on displays, energy readings scrolled across screens, and the air filled with the sound of systems running diagnostics. The Zephyrians were recalibrating their quantum crystalline tower, adjusting the harmonic frequencies. To account for the detected seismic activity, Jack's shelter was complete now. It looked like a simple dome made of brown clay, about 10 feet across and 8 feet high. There was a small entrance on one side, just big enough for a person to crawl through. Compared to the magnificent alien structures surrounding it, Jack's shelter looked like something a child might build in a backyard. It doesn't look like much, Lisa said, running her hand along the smooth clay surface. It's not supposed to look like much, Jack replied, packing his tools back into his box. It's supposed to work. The second tremor was stronger. This time the shaking lasted almost a minute, and Jack could see some of the alien equipment beginning to respond. Force fields flickered briefly, and several holographic displays wavered before stabilizing. The Zephyrian tower swayed slightly, its quantum matrix adjusting to maintain perfect rigidity. The seismic sensors are detecting increasing activity, announced a mushroom-like alien through its translator. The main event is expected within the next 6 hours. Jack looked at his watch. It was just past midnight local time. Lisa, you might want to get some rest while you can. When the big one hits, we're going to be busy. But Lisa was too nervous to sleep. She had been interviewing various alien engineers throughout the day, and their confidence was starting to worry her. Every species seemed absolutely certain that their technology would protect them, but they all had different approaches that might interfere with each other. The hours passed slowly. Small tremors continued to shake the ground every 20 or 30 minutes, each one a little stronger than the last. The alien emergency systems were in full operation now. Energy shields hummed with power, quantum stabilizers created visible distortions in the air, and temporal field generators made some areas seem to shimmer and bend. Jack spent the time checking and rechecking his shelter. He tested the flexibility of the clay, examined the fiber reinforcement, and made sure the entrance was clear. Then he sat down outside the shelter and waited. "Aren't you going to do anything else?" Lisa asked. "Add more reinforcement or install some kind of support system?" "No," Jack said calmly. "Either it works or it doesn't. Adding more stuff at this point would just make it heavier and more complicated." At 6:23 in the morning, the planetary geology team announced that the main earthquake was beginning. Deep underground, massive tectonic plates were starting to move. The seismic waves were building, racing toward the surface at thousands of miles per hour. "Everyone to emergency positions," came the announcement in dozens of languages. "Seismic. Event imminent." Jack stood up and brushed the dust off his clothes. "Lisa, it's time. You can stay out here if you want, but I'm going inside the shelter." Lisa looked at the small clay dome, then at the impressive alien structures with their glowing shields and energy fields. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Jack said, crawling through the entrance. "But the choice is yours." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then followed Jack into the shelter. The inside was surprisingly spacious, with enough room for both of them to sit comfortably. The clay walls were smooth and cool to the touch, and thin. Lines of plant fiber were visible running through the material in complex patterns. "How long do we wait?" Lisa asked. "Not long," Jack replied. "Here it comes." The earthquake hit like a freight train. The ground began to shake violently, and the sound was incredible, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from the center of the planet. Through the small entrance, Jack and Lisa could see the alien structures beginning to respond to the seismic assault. The Zephyrian quantum crystalline tower stood perfectly still for the first few seconds, held in place by its quantum locks. But as the shaking intensified, something went wrong. The tower began to vibrate at its resonant frequency, and the quantum matrix could not compensate fast enough. With a sound like breaking glass, the entire structure shattered into millions of crystalline fragments. "The quantum locks failed," Lisa shouted over the noise. "The tower is destroyed." Jack's shelter was rocking back and forth like a boat on rough water. The clay walls flexed and bent, but they did not crack. The plant fiber reinforcement distributed the stress evenly throughout the structure, allowing it to move with the earthquake rather than fighting against it. Outside, the destruction was getting worse. The butterfly-like alien's multidimensional building was collapsing in on itself, its geometric shapes folding and twisting as the dimensional anchors failed. The structure existed in too many different realities at once, and the earthquake was affecting each dimension differently. The Crystal Being's invisible building suddenly became visible as its cloaking field failed. Jack could see that it was actually a beautiful crystalline structure, but it was rigid and inflexible. As the earthquake continued, cracks appeared in the crystal walls, spreading like spider webs until entire sections began to fall away. The force fields are failing, Lisa reported, watching the chaos through the entrance. The energy shields are flickering on and off. Jack had expected this. Complex systems always failed during disasters, usually in ways that their designers had never imagined. The alien technologies were incredible, but they all depended on precise conditions and perfect coordination. When those conditions changed, the systems could not adapt. The earthquake seemed to go on forever, but it was actually only about 4 minutes of intense shaking. As the main shock waves passed, the violent motion gradually decreased to a steady rumbling, then to occasional tremors, and finally to stillness. Jack crawled out of his shelter first, then helped Lisa emerge. The scene that greeted them was devastating. The magnificent alien structures were in ruins. The Zephyrian Tower was a pile of glittering debris. The multi-dimensional building had collapsed into a twisted wreck of metal and strange materials. The invisible crystal structure was now very visible, and very broken emergency systems were failing everywhere. Sparks flew from damaged equipment. Smoke rose from overloaded power generators, and the air filled with the sounds of alarms and emergency announcements. Aliens were emerging from underground bunkers and emergency shelters, looking around in shock at the destruction. But in the middle of all this chaos, Jack's simple clay shelter stood undamaged. The dome had moved and swayed during the earthquake, but it had not cracked or collapsed. The flexible design had absorbed the seismic energy, and the plant fiber reinforcement had kept the structure intact. "It's still standing," Lisa said in amazement. "Your shelter is the only thing that's still standing." Jack walked around his shelter, examining it carefully. There were a few small cracks in the clay surface, but nothing structural. The foundation had shifted slightly, but the shallow design had allowed it to move as one unit with the ground. Overall, the shelter was in excellent condition. Aliens began to gather around Jack's shelter, staring in disbelief. These were beings whose civilizations had mastered space travel, energy manipulation, and dimensional physics. They had technologies that could reshape matter and bend the laws of physics. But their advanced structures had been destroyed by a natural earthquake, while a simple dome made of clay and plant fibers had survived without major damage. Zex Nath approached, his forearms hanging limply at his sides. His magnificent quantum crystalline tower was now just a pile of debris behind him. "Human," he said, his voice subdued. "Your structure, it survived." "Yes," Jack replied simply. "It did what it was designed to do." "But how?" asked the blue. Tentacled alien whose force field protected building was now a smoking ruin. How did primitive materials outperform our advanced technologies? Jack looked around at the destruction, then back at his modest shelter. Because sometimes the old ways work better than the new ways. Sometimes simple is better than complicated. And sometimes the best technology is the one that doesn't need technology at all. The aliens stood in silence, processing this information. Their entire worldview had been challenged by a simple clay dome built by a human engineer with basic hand tools. As rescue teams began to arrive and emergency crews started clearing the debris, Jack Morrison's shelter stood as proof that human ingenuity could triumph over even the most advanced alien technology. The earthquake was over, but the real learning was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastated summit grounds. Jack Morrison stood beside his clay shelter, watching rescue teams work to clear the debris from the destroyed alien structures. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Where magnificent towers and impossible buildings had stood just hours before, and there were now only piles of broken crystal, twisted metal, and smoking ruins. But his simple dome sat unchanged, its brown clay surface warming in the sunlight. Lisa Parker was interviewing rescue workers when she noticed something important happening. Small groups of aliens were approaching Jack's shelter, not to mock or laugh this time, but to study it with genuine curiosity. They walked around the dome slowly, examining every detail of its construction. Zixnath was the first to speak. The proud Zephyrian engineer looked very different now. His 4 arms were covered in dust from the ruins of his quantum crystalline tower, and his confidence was completely gone. "Human Jack Morrison," he said formally, "I must ask you to explain how this was possible." Jack was sitting on a piece of wood he had found in the debris, cleaning clay from under his fingernails. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," said the blue tentacled alien, whose name Jack had learned was Velcron. "Our force field generators failed. Our quantum stabilizers failed. Our dimensional anchors failed. Every advanced technology we deployed was destroyed. But your primitive shelter survived without damage." "It's not primitive," Jack said gently. "It's just different. Can I show you something?" Jack stood up and walked to a pile of debris from the Zephyrian tower. He picked up 2 pieces of the crystalline material, both about the size of his fist. "This crystal is incredibly strong, right?" "Probably 1,000 times stronger than my clay." 10,000 times stronger, Zexnath corrected. "That crystal can withstand pressures that would crush diamond." Jack nodded and held up the 2 pieces. "But look what happened to it." The crystal had broken along perfectly straight lines, creating sharp edges and flat surfaces. When the stress became too much, it failed completely and suddenly. There was no warning, no gradual weakening. One moment it was perfect, the next moment it was broken. Jack walked back to his shelter and broke off a small piece of the clay wall. The clay came away in a rough chunk, leaving a small depression that did not affect the rest of the structure. "Now look at this. The clay is much weaker than your crystal, but when it fails gradually and partially. This small piece broke off, but the rest of the wall is still strong." More aliens were gathering now. Word was spreading throughout the summit that the human simple shelter had survived while their advanced technologies had failed. Species that Jack had never seen before were arriving to examine his work. A tall alien that looked like a walking tree approached the group. "I am Groot Vel of the Dendrian Collective. Our organic architecture was completely destroyed." "How did your structure, which appears to be made of the most basic organic materials, survive when ours did not?" Jack thought about how to explain this. "Your organic buildings were trying to be like machines. They were grown to exact specifications, with every cell and fiber precisely controlled. But natural materials work best when they're allowed to be imperfect." He pointed to the plant fibers visible in his clay wall. "These fibers aren't all the same length or thickness. Some are strong, some are weak. Some run in one direction, some in another. When stress hits the wall, the load gets distributed among all these different fibers. If some break, others take up the slack." "But our biological structures were engineered for optimal performance," Grootvel protested. "Every component was designed to be perfect." "That's exactly the problem," Jack said. "When everything is perfect, everything fails at the same time. When things are imperfect, they fail at different times and in different ways, so the whole system keeps working." Lisa was recording everything, recognizing that she was witnessing a historic moment. These advanced civilizations were learning fundamental lessons about engineering from a human who worked with the most basic materials. A new alien approached the group. This one was small and round, with metallic skin that reflected the sunlight. "I am Zap Knox, chief engineer of the Quantum Mechanics Guild. Our temporal stabilizers were designed to slow down time around our structures, giving them more time to respond to seismic stress. The theory was sound. Why did it fail?" Jack scratched his head, leaving a small streak of clay in his hair. "I'm not really qualified to talk about temporal mechanics, but I can tell you about timing and earthquake engineering. The thing about earthquakes is that they happen in real time, at the speed that the Earth moves. You can't slow that down or speed it up. You have to work with the natural timing of the event." He demonstrated by picking up a stick and bending it slowly, then quickly. "If I bend this stick slowly, I can control exactly how much stress I'm applying. But an earthquake doesn't give you that luxury. The stress comes fast and hard, and your building has to respond instantly. Not after some computer calculates the optimal response. Zapnox's metallic surface dulled slightly. Our systems required 0.3 seconds to analyze the seismic data and calculate the appropriate response. Are you saying that was too slow? I'm saying that my clay responded in 0 seconds, Jack replied. It didn't need to calculate anything. It just bent when the ground moved, automatically and immediately. The crowd of aliens was growing larger. Engineers from dozens of different species were abandoning their cleanup efforts to listen to Jack's explanations. Some were taking notes, others were recording the conversation, and many were simply staring at the simple clay shelter that had accomplished what their advanced technologies could not. Velcron asked the question that many of them were thinking. If these principles are so effective, why did our civilizations abandon them? Jack considered this carefully. I think maybe because you got so good at controlling your environment that you forgot how to work with it. On Earth, we still deal with earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and other natural disasters regularly. We can't control them, so we have to learn to live with them. He gestured toward the alien ruins. All of your technologies were designed to impose your will on nature. Force fields to stop the earthquake, quantum locks to prevent movement, temporal fields to change the timing. But nature doesn't care about your will. It's going to do what it does regardless. So what do you suggest? Asked Zexnath. That we abandon our advanced technologies and return to building with mud? No, Jack said with a smile. I'm suggesting that you remember the principles behind why things work. Flexibility over rigidity, simplicity over complexity. Working with natural forces instead of fighting against them. You can probably apply those principles to your advanced technologies and make them even better. A new voice spoke from the back of the crowd. The human is correct. The aliens parted to make way for a figure that Jack had not seen before. It was tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to be made of flowing silver. I am Prime Architect Silvex of the Galactic Engineering Council. I have been observing this situation with great interest. The other aliens became very quiet and respectful. Jack realized he was meeting someone very important. Human Jack Morrison, Silvex continued, your demonstration has been most educational. It appears that, in our pursuit of technological advancement, we may have lost sight of some fundamental engineering principles. Jack felt a little nervous meeting such a high-ranking official. I don't think your technologies are wrong, sir. They're incredibly impressive. I just think maybe they could benefit from some of the ideas we still use on Earth. Indeed, Silvex said, walking around Jack's shelter and examining it closely. Tell me, would you be willing to share these principles with other members of the galactic engineering community? Of course, Jack replied. That's what engineers do. We share knowledge to help solve problems. Silvex's silver skin seemed to glow slightly. Then I would like to extend an invitation. The Galactic Engineering Academy is always seeking new perspectives on fundamental engineering principles. Would you consider joining our faculty as a visiting professor? Jack was speechless for a moment. A few days ago, these aliens had been laughing at his primitive tools and methods. Now they were offering him a position at their most prestigious institution. I would be honored, Jack finally managed to say. Lisa stepped forward with her recording device. Can I ask what you plan to teach? Jack looked around at all the alien faces watching him expectantly, then at his simple clay shelter that had started this whole conversation. I guess I'll teach them that sometimes the best technology is the technology that doesn't need technology. That sometimes the smartest thing you can do is build something simple that works, instead of something complicated that might not. Silvex nodded approvingly. Wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. The Galactic Engineering Council has much to learn from human ingenuity. As the day progressed, more and more aliens came to examine Jack's shelter and hear his explanations. Engineers who had spent centuries mastering complex technologies found themselves taking notes on clay composition and fiber orientation. Species that could manipulate matter at the quantum level were learning about the benefits of imperfection and flexibility.